In 1997, two historians made a prediction. They said that sometime around 2005, America would enter a period of crisis, not an ordinary crisis, a fourth turning, they called it, a 20-year period of upheaval that would destroy the existing order and create a new one. They compared it to the American Revolution, to the Civil War, to the Great Depression and World War II. They predicted this crisis would fully coalesce around 2020, that it would test every institution, strain every alliance, and force Americans to rediscover what they were willing to sacrifice for. That by the time it was over, around the end of the 2020s, the country would be fundamentally transformed, for better or worse depending on choices not yet made. In 1997, this sounded like prophecy, wild speculation dressed up in historical costume. Who could take seriously the claim that history moves in predictable cycles, that generations follow patterns, that crisis comes on schedule? Then came September 11th. Then the financial collapse of 2008. Then the political fracturing. Then the pandemic. Then everything else. William Strauss died in 2007 before he could see his predictions tested. Neil Howe is still writing, still tracking the crisis he saw coming decades ago. Their book, The Fourth Turning, has become a strange cultural artifact, dismissed as pseudoscience by academics, embraced as scripture by some political movements, and haunting the rest of us who wonder if maybe, just maybe, they saw something real. Part 1. The Theory. William Strauss was born in Chicago in 1947 and grew up in Burlingame, California. He graduated from Harvard in 1969. Then earned both a law degree and a master's in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School, where he was part of the program's first graduating class. After working in Washington as a policy aide on the Presidential Clemency Board, studying the impact of Vietnam on the generation that fought it, he took an unexpected turn. In 1981, while working as a Senate staffer for Charles Percy, Strauss organized colleagues to perform satirical songs at the office Christmas party. The performance was so successful that Strauss co-founded the Capitol Steps, a political satire troupe that would eventually become a $3 million company performing across the country. He wrote many of the songs himself, performed off-Broadway, and recorded 29 albums. Neil Howe was born in Santa Monica in 1951. His grandfather was the astronomer Robert Julius Trumpler. His father was a physicist, his mother a professor of occupational therapy. Howe studied at Berkeley, then abroad in France and Germany, before earning graduate degrees in economics and history from Yale. He wrote about fiscal policy and demographic change before meeting Strauss in the late 1980s. What brought them together was a shared obsession, generations, not as marketing demographics, but as historical actors, shaping and shaped by their moment in time. They noticed that different people had written generational histories before, but no one had tried to identify patterns across centuries. So they did. Their first collaboration, Generations, The History of America's Future, 1584 to 2069, was published in 1991. It traced generational biographies from the colonial era to the present, identifying 18 generations and arguing that certain patterns repeated across Anglo-American history. Vice President Al Gore called it the most stimulating book on American history he'd ever read and sent a copy to every member of Congress. Newt Gingrich called it an intellectual tour de force. In a throwaway line, the book predicted a major crisis would hit America around 2020. A decade later, when the towers fell, people remembered. The Fourth Turning, published in 1997, developed their theory in full. The core claim is deceptively simple. History is not linear. It does not march steadily forward toward progress or decline. History is cyclical. It moves in seasons. Strauss and Howe identify a unit of historical time they call the cyclical, a Latin word meaning roughly the span of a long human life, about 80 to 100 years. Within each cyclical are 4 turnings, each lasting about 20 to 25 years. The turnings follow a fixed sequence, like seasons following one another. Spring, summer, fall, winter, high, awakening, unraveling, crisis. The first turning is the high. This is spring after winter, the period following a crisis. Institutions are strong because they were just rebuilt to solve the emergency. Individualism is weak because collective action saved everyone. Society is confident, optimistic, conformist. People want to belong. The most recent American high ran from 1946 to 1964, the post-war boom, the era of organization, men and suburban tract houses, of confident institutions and shared purpose. America built highways and schools and moon rockets. Everyone knew who the enemy was. Everyone knew what team they were on. The previous high followed, the Civil War, Reconstruction. Before that, the era after the Revolutionary War. The second turning is the awakening. Summer arrives. The conformity of the high becomes stifling. Young people rebel against the institutions their parents built. Spirituality and self-expression flourish. Authority is questioned. Culture wars erupt between generations. People want to defy. The most recent awakening ran from the mid to 1960s through the early 1980s. The counterculture, Woodstock, Vietnam protests, the Jesus movement, the rise of the religious right, the consciousness revolution. The previous awakening was the transcendentalist period before the Civil War, the era of religious revivals, utopian communities, abolitionist fervor. The third turning is the unraveling. Autumn. The awakening has shattered the old consensus but created no new one. Institutions are weak and distrusted. Individualism is rampant. Culture feels fragmented, cynical, polarized. People want to separate. Problems accumulate because no one trusts the institutions that might solve them. The most recent unraveling ran from roughly 1984 through the mid-2000s. The Reagan era through the culture wars, a time of declining civic engagement, rising inequality, and institutional decay. The deficit grew, trust eroded. Everyone became their own brand. The fourth turning is the crisis, winter. The problems that accumulated during the unraveling finally erupt. A catalyst event, economic collapse, war, revolution, or some combination, forces society to confront what it has been avoiding. Institutions are either destroyed or radically remade. Sacrifice is demanded. People want to gather. The old order dies. A new order is born through struggle. The outcome is never guaranteed. The previous fourth turnings were the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the Depression World War II sequence. Each destroyed one world and built another. The turnings are driven by generations moving through life phases. 4 generational archetypes repeat in sequence. Prophets, born in a high, come of age in an awakening. Nomads, born in an awakening, come of age in an unraveling. Heroes, born in an unraveling, come of age in a crisis. And artists, born in a crisis, come of age in a high. Each generation carries the imprint of the era in which it was raised and plays a characteristic role in each turning to experiences. Strauss and Howe sum it up in one sentence. In a high, people want to belong. In an awakening, to defy. In an unraveling, to separate. In a crisis, to gather. The cycle drives itself through generations. Children raised in one turning come of age in the next, and their formative experiences shape how they behave when they reach power. Kids who grew up in the comfortable conformity of a high rebel during the awakening that follows. Kids who grew up in the chaos of an unraveling hunger for order when crisis arrives. The generations don't just experience the turnings, they cause them. Strauss and Howe trace this pattern back 5 centuries through Anglo-American history. The English Civil War and Glorious Revolution, the American Revolution, the Civil War, the Depression and World War II. Each saeculum different in its details but similar in its rhythm. Each fourth turning, destroying what came before and building what came after. They acknowledge the theory has limits. It applies most clearly to America and Britain. Other societies may have different rhythms or no rhythm at all. The dates are approximate. Turnings don't start and end on schedule like train departures. And the specific events that define a turning are visible only in hindsight. But the pattern, they argue, is real. History is not random. It has seasons. Part 2. The predictions. What made the fourth turning remarkable was not just its theory, but its willingness to make specific predictions. Strauss and Howe did not hedge. They told readers what to expect. They predicted that America would enter its next fourth turning sometime between 2005 and 2015. The catalyst could take many forms: a terrorist attack, a financial panic, a constitutional crisis, a war. But something would happen that would make business as usual impossible. The unraveling's problems would stop being problems you could ignore and become crises you had to face. Writing in 1997, here's what they said: sometime before the year 2025, America will pass through a great gate in history, commensurate with the American Revolution, Civil War, and twin emergencies of the Great Depression and World War II. The very survival of the nation will feel at stake. Sometime around the year 2005, perhaps a few years before or after, America will enter the fourth turning. They predicted the crisis would reach its climax around 2020 and resolve by approximately 2025 to 2030. The resolution could be triumphant: a new civic order rising from the ashes, institutions rebuilt and trusted again, a generation forged by sacrifice, or it could be catastrophic. Fourth turnings had ended in victory before, but they had also ended in defeat, division, and destruction. The Civil War fourth turning nearly ended the nation. Nothing guaranteed a happy ending. They predicted that during the crisis, the generational archetypes would play their characteristic roles. The boomers, the prophet generation born in the high, would be entering elderhood, providing visionary but potentially divisive leadership, calling for total solutions. Generation the 10th, the nomad generation born in the awakening, would be in midlife, providing pragmatic, skeptical, battle-hardened management, doing whatever it took to survive. The millennials, the hero generation born in the unraveling, would be coming of age, asked to sacrifice and build as the GI generation had before them, potentially becoming the next great civic generation. They predicted the mood of the country would shift dramatically. The irony and cynicism of the unraveling would give way to deadly seriousness. The distrust of institutions would give way to demands for strong institutions. The individualism would give way to collectivism. Society would swing from me to we, whether it wanted to or not, because crises demand collective action. Entertainment would become more earnest. Politics would become more urgent. The stakes would feel existential because they would be. They were explicit about what they did not know. They could not predict the specific catalyst, whether terrorism or economic collapse or pandemic or something else, would strike the match. They could not predict whether America would win or lose, whether the crisis would produce renewal or ruin. They could not predict how severe or how long the crisis would be. History rhymes but does not repeat exactly. Each fourth turning is different even as the pattern holds. They offered scenarios. A global terrorist organization blows up an aircraft. A financial crisis bankrupts governments. A pandemic spreads. A disputed election leads to secession. Foreign powers take advantage of American division. Domestic movements contest the legitimacy of the government itself. They stressed these were possibilities, not prophecies. The specific trigger mattered less than the timing. A society at the end of an unraveling with depleted social trust and accumulated problems would eventually face a reckoning. They even predicted what would happen in the crisis. Public authority would be reasserted. Culture wars would fade. As new wars took their place, one side would win, and a new social contract would emerge. Every fourth turning had produced a new America, the Republic, the reunited nation, the superpower. This one would too. The question was what kind? In 1991, writing in a journal called American Demographics, they made a prediction that now reads as eerie. Around the year 2005, society will probably begin a new crisis era, one that may last for 2 decades. It will present events that are massive in scale, dramatic in nature, and unprecedented for many living Americans. It will end with a resolution that will set a new national direction for another 8 or 9 decades. History warns that this resolution could be as harsh as the Civil War, as beneficial as the World War II triumph, or as ambivalent as the revolution itself. They went further. They described what a fourth turning feels like from the inside. The feeling that everything is at stake. The sense that the old rules no longer apply. The discovery that institutions you took for granted are weaker than you thought. The demand for sacrifice. The emergence of leaders who seem to embody the moment, for better or worse. The tendency for moderates to be swept aside by true believers. The narrowing of debate to fundamental questions. Who are we? What do we stand for? What are we willing to fight for? They predicted that technology would not stop the crisis, that in fact it would accelerate it. Each fourth turning in American history had seen greater destruction than the last, enabled by advancing technology. The Revolution was fought with muskets, the Civil War with rifles and cannons, World War II with tanks and bombers and atomic weapons. The next crisis, they warned, would be fought with whatever tools the 21st century provided. Cyber warfare, drones, perhaps weapons not yet invented. They predicted the international order would be tested. Previous fourth turnings had reshuffled great power relationships. Britain gained an empire after one, lost it after another. America rose from regional backwater to global superpower. The next crisis would redistribute power again. Old alliances would strain or break. New alliances would form. By the time it ended, the world would look different. And they predicted something that cuts close to home for anyone living through these years. The crisis would not feel like history. It would feel like chaos. Only in hindsight would the pattern become clear. Only after the storm would people see that what felt like random catastrophe was actually winter arriving on schedule. Part 3. The Evidence and the Critics. How do you evaluate a theory like this? The predictions are dramatic enough to test, which is more than most theories of history offer, but testing them requires deciding what counts as confirmation and what counts as refutation. The case for Strauss and Howe looks stronger than it did in 1997. They predicted a crisis catalyst in the 2005 to 2015 window. The 2008 financial collapse fits, as does the ongoing aftermath of September 11th. They predicted the crisis would coalesce around 2020, a pandemic, political crisis, social upheaval, and contested election arrived on schedule. They predicted a shift from individualism to demands for collective action. That shift is visible in politics across the spectrum, from the rise of democratic socialism to nationalist populism. They predicted institutions would either be rebuilt or collapse. Institutions are visibly being contested, defended, and attacked. The pattern they described seems to be playing out. David Kaiser, a historian at the Naval War College who was interviewed for a documentary about the theory, has argued that the predictions have largely come true. He has incorporated their framework into his own historical work, including American Tragedy and No End Save Victory. In 1997, Kaiser wrote that if America calmly made it to 2015, Strauss and Howe's work would end up in the ash can of history, but if they were right, they would take their place among the great American prophets. Kaiser has since argued that the crises they predicted seem to have arrived, but the critics raise serious objections. The first objection is that the theory is unfalsifiable. The turnings are defined vaguely enough that almost any events can be fit into the framework after the fact. If a crisis happens, it confirms the theory. If it doesn't happen exactly on schedule, the dates are approximate anyway. If the crisis takes an unexpected form, well, they said they couldn't predict the specific catalyst. A theory that can explain anything predicts nothing. Peter Turchin, a specialist in cultural evolution and cloud dynamics, has criticized the theory for forcing the historical record to fit a postulated cycle by stretching in some places and cutting off a bit here and there in others. The second objection is that the generational archetypes are stereotypes, not science. Generations contain multitudes. The claim that all boomers are visionary prophets or all millennials are heroic team players is obviously false at the individual level. Strauss and Howe acknowledge this but argue the archetypes describe aggregate tendencies. Critics respond that even the aggregate claims are not supported by rigorous evidence, just pattern matching that confirms what the authors already believe. Eric Hoover, writing in the Chronicle of Higher Education, described them as pioneers of a burgeoning industry of generational consultants, but questioned the scientific basis of their claims. The third objection is that the theory is America-centric and may not apply elsewhere. Strauss and Howe focused almost exclusively on Anglo-American history. Other countries have different generational experiences, different institutional structures, different rhythms. A theory of universal historical cycles should apply universally. This one doesn't clearly do so. China's cycles, Europe's cycles, the developing world cycles, none of them fit neatly into the Anglo-American framework. The fourth objection is that the theory can become self-fulfilling. If political actors believe they are in a fourth turning, they may act in ways that create the crisis they expect. Steve Bannon, the political strategist who served as White House chief strategist in 2017, has explicitly invoked the fourth turning to frame his worldview. He produced a documentary called Generation Zero based on the theory. According to Kaiser, who was interviewed for the film, Bannon pressed him to say that the coming fourth turning would involve a war at least as big as World War II. Bannon seemed to anticipate, perhaps even welcome, global conflict as confirmation of the theory. A 2017 Business Insider article titled "Steve Bannon's Obsession with a Dark Theory of History Should Be Worrisome" reported that Bannon seemed to be trying to bring about the fourth turning. If enough powerful people believe crisis is inevitable and even necessary, they may engineer crisis or refuse to avert it. The theory becomes not a prediction but a script. Michael Lind, a historian and co-founder of the New America Foundation, called the fourth turning vague and verging on pseudoscience. He wrote that the author's predictions turn out to be as vague as those of fortune cookies. Jeremy Peters, writing in the New York Times in 2017, noted that many academic historians dismissed the book as about as scientific as astrology or a Nostradamus text. A Quartz article from the same period called "The Theory Generational Pseudoscience That Prepared America for Steve Bannon's Apocalyptic Message." David Greenberg, a professor of history and media studies at Rutgers University, described Strauss-Howe generational theory as crackpot theories in an article for Politico. The criticism from academia has been consistent, interesting ideas perhaps, but not rigorous history. Too neat, too flexible, too much like prophecy dressed up as scholarship. There is also the problem of what might be called confirmation bias in reverse. Once you know about the theory, you start seeing evidence for it everywhere. Every headline becomes proof. Every crisis becomes confirmation. But the same events might look entirely different without the framework. Is America really in a fourth turning, or are we just pattern matching on noise? The question haunts anyone who takes the theory seriously. Howe has responded to critics by arguing that they misunderstand what the theory claims. It is not meant to predict specific events. It is meant to identify seasons, moods, dispositions. A farmer knows winter is coming without knowing exactly when the first frost will hit. The farmer prepares anyway. That, Howe argues, is what the fourth turning offers. Not a prophecy, but a warning. Not a map, but a compass. The defenders respond that the critics miss the point. Strauss and Howe never claimed scientific precision. They claimed a pattern, a rhythm, a season. The theory is not a clock, but a calendar. It tells you winter is coming without telling you exactly when the first snow will fall. And maybe that is enough. Maybe knowing that crises recur, that they follow patterns, that they can be survived. Maybe that knowledge has value even if the details remain uncertain. Part 4. What if they're right? Set aside the question of whether Strauss and Howe are scientifically correct. Ask instead, what if they are approximately right? What if history does move in something like cycles, and what if we are living through something like a fourth turning? What follows? The first implication is that the crisis is not an aberration. It is a recurring feature of human society. Every 80 years or so, the problems accumulate, the institutions decay, and something has to break. This can be terrifying or liberating depending on how you look at it. Terrifying because crisis is coming whether you want it or not. Liberating because crisis is survivable. Societies have survived fourth turnings before and emerged stronger. The American Revolution produced a republic. The Civil War preserved the Union. The Depression and World War II created the most powerful nation in history. Survival was never guaranteed, but it was possible. The second implication is that the outcome depends on choices. Strauss and Howe are clear that fourth turnings can end well or badly. The American Revolution succeeded. The French Revolution devoured its children. The Union won the Civil War. Germany lost both world wars. The Depression could have ended in fascism. It ended in the New Deal and victory over fascism abroad. Nothing is automatic. The choices made during crisis shape what emerges. Leaders matter. Sacrifice matters. The willingness to subordinate individual interests to collective survival matters. The third implication concerns generational roles. If the pattern holds, the generations alive today have parts to play. The boomers, in elderhood, will either provide wise leadership or destructive zealotry. They have the capacity for both, and their track record during the unraveling was mixed. Generation the 10th, in midlife, will either manage the crisis pragmatically or fail to bridge the divides. They are skeptical of grand visions, but capable of getting things done. The millennials, in young adulthood, will either rise to the heroic role history seems to be casting them in, or disappoint, as every hero generation has risked doing. Generation Z, still young, will be shaped by the crisis in ways that will define them for decades. Strauss and Howe noted that before the Depression, nobody thought the young GI generation was anything special. They were called soft, pampered, lacking the toughness of their parents. Then crisis came, and they became the greatest generation. The same pattern could repeat, or it could fail to repeat if this generation lacks the opportunity or the will to answer the call. The fourth implication is about institutions. Fourth turnings destroy institutions that no longer work and build new ones that do. The question is which institutions will fall and what will replace them. In previous fourth turnings, political parties realigned, economic systems transformed, international orders collapsed and were rebuilt. The same processes may be underway now. The institutions we take for granted may not survive. The institutions that will matter in 2040 may not exist yet. Social media is barely 20 years old. The smartphone is younger than most college students. The institutions of the future are being built in the crisis, not before it. The fifth implication is personal. If you believe you are living through a fourth turning, it changes how you think about your own life. The choices you make matter more than they would in ordinary times. The habits you form, the communities you build, the sacrifices you make or refuse to make, these are not just personal decisions. They are contributions to or subtractions from whatever emerges from the crisis. In a high or an unraveling, you can be a spectator. In a crisis, everyone is drafted. Strauss and Howe offer practical advice. Prepare for turbulence. Build community. Think long-term. Don't fight the cycle. Work within it. If the mood is shifting toward collective action, find ways to channel that energy constructively. If institutions are being rebuilt, participate in rebuilding them. If sacrifice is demanded, figure out what you're willing to give. But there's a darker possibility they acknowledge, that knowing the pattern doesn't save you from it. Cassandra could see the future but couldn't change it. The Greeks knew about hubris but committed it anyway. Understanding the cycle may just mean watching it unfold with your eyes open. There is also the question of agency. If fourth turnings are inevitable, does it matter what we do? If the crisis was going to come regardless of our choices, are we just passengers on a train with a predetermined destination? Strauss and Howe reject this fatalism. The turnings are inevitable, they argue, but the outcomes are not. The train is going somewhere, but we're still choosing the track. We're still deciding who drives. This is perhaps the most useful way to read the fourth turning, not as prophecy, but as preparation, not as a prediction of what will happen, but as a framework for understanding what is happening. If you know you're in winter, you can prepare for winter. If you know institutions are being remade, you can participate in remaking them. If you know sacrifice will be demanded, you can think about what you're willing to give. The theory suggests that the people who thrive in fourth turnings are not those who resist the season, but those who understand it. The entrepreneurs who build new institutions while old ones crumble. The leaders who channel collective energy rather than fighting it. The communities that bind together while others fall apart. The individuals who recognize that their personal choices now carry historical weight. And there is one more implication, perhaps the most sobering of all. Fourth turnings end. They always end. The crisis resolves. A new order emerges. Life goes on. But the people who live through fourth turnings are never the same. They carry the crisis in their bones. They pass its lessons to their children. They become the veterans of an experience that their grandchildren will struggle to understand. If Strauss and Howe are right, we are those people. We are the ones who will tell our grandchildren what it was like. The question is what story we will tell. William Strauss died in December 2007, just before the financial crisis hit. He was 60 years old, having battled pancreatic cancer for 9 years. He had spent his final years founding the Cappies, a program for high school theater students and advising teenagers writing musicals. He was still fascinated by the next generation, still believing they would be special, still waiting to see what they would become. Neil Howe continues to write and speak. In 2023, he published The Fourth Turning is Here, an update that argues the crisis is now fully underway and will likely resolve by the end of the 2020s. He has watched his predictions unfold with the strange satisfaction and dread of someone who warned of fire and then watched the building burn. He is 73 years old, living in Great Falls, Virginia, still tracking the cycle he has spent his life studying. Their theory remains controversial. It is not accepted by mainstream historians. It is not taught in universities. It lacks the empirical rigor that academic social science demands. The pattern matching that makes it compelling also makes it suspicious. Too neat, too flexible, too easy to see what you want to see. One critic compared it to astrology. Another called it an elaborate historical horoscope. And yet, something is happening. Trust in institutions has collapsed across the political spectrum. Political polarization has made governance nearly impossible. Technology has transformed how we work, communicate, and understand reality. The international order is fracturing. Climate disruption is accelerating. The sense that we are living through extraordinary times is nearly universal, even among people who have never heard of Strauss and Howe. Maybe it is a fourth turning. Maybe history really does move in cycles and we are living through winter. Maybe the crisis will resolve in the next few years and a new order will emerge, better or worse than what came before, depending on choices we are making right now. Or maybe Strauss and Howe saw patterns that weren't really there, and history is just one damn thing after another with no rhythm and no seasons. Maybe the chaos is permanent, or maybe it will resolve in ways their theory doesn't predict. The honest answer is that we don't know. We are too close to events to see them clearly. Only hindsight will reveal whether the pattern held. But the question they force us to ask is valuable regardless of whether their answer is correct. What if this is not normal? What if we are living through a hinge of history? A moment when decisions matter more than usual, when the institutions we rebuild or destroy will shape generations we will never meet? If that possibility is real, even partly real, then the question is not whether to believe in fourth turnings. The question is what to do with the time we have.